hypothesis that I and Herb Clark and others were looking at in the mid-1980s was something called the obstacle hypothesis. And the obstacle hypothesis said that making requests of other typically interrupts the listener doing whatever he or she is doing. And so what a speaker has to do is to find a way of inserting the request into the conversation, into the ongoing flow of activities in such a way as to maximize this listener fulfilling the request. And specifically, we suggested that people formulate a request in a specific way that deals with the listener's greatest potential obstacle in that context in complying with the request. So one test of this is I have a whole bunch of experiments on this, but let me tell you about one of them. This is a naturalistic kind of pragmatic experiment where I designed, I took people, students, on a tour of my campus. And we went to 6 different kinds of locations. And I brought them to different places that I kind of set up a little situation. So for example, I brought a student into a library, the university library, and I brought them over to a table. And there was a student working on a paper. And I said to my participant, my subject, all right, imagine you're sitting across from that person, and you're working on a paper, and you run out of ink. Your pen no longer works. And so you want to borrow a pen from that person. What would you say? And so the subject kind of go, I don't know, I'd say, do you have a pen I could borrow? Now, what I did was to try to set up the situation so that it appeared that there was one obstacle that was most salient. So in this particular case, there was no other pens available, so it wasn't clear whether the person actually even had a pen that they could actually lend you. So the possession of the object that was requested was the thing that was the most salient obstacle. And what was cool, from my point of view, in this experiment is that across all the participants that I ran and across all of these different contexts, people specified the greatest potential obstacle 74% of the time. And in psychological experimental terms, that's a good number. That's a statistically significant number. So for example, in the possession thing, they would say things like, do you have a pen I could borrow? Now the problem here, and this is the problem of all experiments, is that this observed regularity in people's pragmatic behavior is based on an average. That is to say, not every subject in the experiment did this correctly, did it follow the obstacle hypothesis. Some did it more than others. Some did it none at all. And in fact, so for example, people sometimes in a case where the obstacle was possession, they would say things like, can I borrow a pen, which was about ability. So maybe in these cases where people didn't follow the so-called preferred hypothesis, they tried to specify the obstacle, but they just assessed the situation incorrectly and thus came up with an inappropriate kind of indirect request. But in general, we don't know why these other people, or these people sometimes didn't do this thing in the way that we thought they should. And the question is, does it matter? We've observed this regularity. We're interested in regularities in pragmatic performance. But the question is, what about the people who didn't do it right? What's wrong with them? And in psychological experiments, we typically think of data that sometimes goes against our hypothesis as just sometimes being error, something that's not particularly of interest theoretically to anybody. But it's interesting, particularly in this other experiments that I did, if you don't state the hypothesis correctly, and this is an experiment I did in a laboratory looking at people's readings of indirect requests in context. There's a cognitive cost in not doing that correctly. So if you read a request that wasn't appropriate in stating the obstacle, it takes you about 300 milliseconds more to process it than if the request was stated appropriate to the obstacle. 300 milliseconds is a very short period of time, but mentally, cognitively, it's significant. And if you think of a person going around through life stating things inappropriately, there's going to be problems in terms of miscommunications, in terms of being able to get the kinds of things they want by making requests of others. So the question then is, what do we do about that? How do we deal with that variability? Here's another kind of experiment. This is one more recently. This is an experiment looking at people's pragmatic knowledge and answering questions about the time. And this is also having to do with a naturalistic kind of pragmatic experiments where we went up to students and people at my university's campus at certain places, and we went up to them and just said, excuse me, do you have the time? And then we secretly tape recorded what they said. And so people could say things like, It's about 4. It's 3 minutes before 4. It's 3:57. They said a whole bunch of different kinds of things. But there was a regularity in people's responses, and this is something that was originally noted by Van de Henst et al., but something we replicated here, is that, interestingly, people typically gave rounded answers rather than exact times, even when they were wearing digital watches. So they're looking at their digital watch, it's presenting an exact time, and the answer they give is rounded from that. Now, why are they doing that? Well, it appears here that they're not being egocentric. The most easy thing to do is just to read off what the watch says, but they're not doing that. So this is clear that they're not sort of being completely egocentric or they're governed by some maxim to try and be truthful all the time, but rather the idea here is that people are giving answers that appear to them to be optimally relevant given the circumstances. And how do we also know this? Well, in another experiment, or rather another part of this is that when we actually measured, we took these tape recordings and we looked at how long it took people to actually plan out and produce their responses. And it's interesting that when people did give exact times when wearing digital watches, it took them longer to do that than when they actually rounded off. So it's like they're looking at their watch and exact time, and is this relevant to the person? I don't know, okay, here we go, right? But, this is the interesting part, you change the context slightly. So instead of saying, excuse me, do you have the time? You go, excuse me, my watch has stopped. Do you have the time? Now, people look at digital watch wearers, look at their watches, and they spit out the exact time. Why? Because that is now the most optimally relevant thing to do, given the presumption that the person who mentioned my watch has stopped probably wants to maybe reset their watch, and an exact time in that case is entirely appropriate. So, in that sense, they're doing things that they're seen as being they're striving for optimal relevance as they speak, and it depends and it shifts depending upon the nature of the context. Once again here, this kind of data reflects broad statistical regularities and doesn't account for all the linguistic behaviors of people. That is to say, in some context here, people actually gave exact time answers to the simple "do you have the time" question, even when they were wearing an analog watch. So they weren't exactly, in that case, being the most optimally appropriate. And that required more effort on the people who were wearing analog watches to produce that exact time rather than just giving a rounded one. So that's a kind of behavior that's variation here. And then people also sometimes gave exact time answers quite quickly when wearing digital watches in the simple "do you have time," contrary to this more general pattern that was observed. But in general then, we have this issue of like we got some strong regularities here, and then we have some people who sometimes are just simply not doing it the way that we thought. And again, the question is, what's up with them? And we can ask ourselves, is it possible to explain all of the data? Or do we just say, here's the generality, that's the important thing, the hell with these other people who don't do it the way that we wanted them to? Could we say that these people who don't perform exactly as preferred, are they egocentric? Are they lazy? Perhaps they're stupid. Sometimes I've even heard, well, what do you expect from students in California? I mean, I've actually gotten that in reviews of journal articles, like, well, these are from students in California. That's not really representative of the real world here. We can ask, might there be some people who walk around and they're not into the optimal principle of optimal relevance, or they kind of do it some of the time, but not all of the time? How do we explain this combination of the regularity and the variation in our data? Well, let me now go to another issue and just speak about this more broadly. And this is one that I've participated in at various times over the years. And this is the debate between whether or not people are cooperative in their speaking or actually are egocentric. And Istvan talked about this in his presentation the other day. And generally, we often think that speakers mutually recognize their intentions and goals and make joint efforts when talking to one another to achieve these. And one possibility that's been proposed is that people have something called the common ground, various knowledge they share with others, and they know that they share with others, and this is something that guides how they speak, the exact words they say, as well as the aspects of their understanding. And common ground has been discussed and described in a variety of ways. Herb Clark talks about it in certain ways. Isfan and Zhang talk about it in a slightly different way. As Isfan talked about the other day, relevance theory has a sort of a different kind of point of view in all this. But one of the interesting things that's happened within experimental psychology is although there's a lot of data from particularly work by Herb Clark showing in these experimental tasks that people really do seem to build up a sense of common ground in some tasks. And really, as it builds up, it really shapes quite nicely the way people speak and understand one another. It really looks like common ground is a guiding thing that constrains what they're doing pragmatically. But there's all this other data that's kind of slowly coming out, particularly the work of Boaz Kazar and his collaborators, suggesting that people sometimes can be very egocentric when they're speaking and understanding. And in some experiments, they show that speakers often overestimate what they mutually share with others. They think there's a lot of so-called common ground at work there, and there isn't. And that makes them actually speak more egocentrically than perhaps they are. And one possibility here is that speakers may initially be egocentric, both in terms of the language they produce and what they understand, and then only later bring in sort of more pragmatic knowledge to make right decisions about what it is that speakers are doing. Kazar and others suggest here that egocentrism is something that comes in particular situations, particularly when people are under stress or where they're under a kind of a cognitive load, which perhaps prevents them from being more interested in trying to establish common ground and use that common ground with speaking and understanding with one another. So the question is, how do we deal with this debate? There's a lot of evidence on both sides. One clue, I think, here, and this is true of all sorts of debates in psycholinguistics and psychology more generally, the data you get depends upon the task you use. So it turns out that you can get people acting cooperatively in tasks where you ask them and instruct them to kind of cooperate. They have to do that, given some joint project that they have to achieve. And other kinds of studies, particularly the ones that Boaz Kazar and others, some of those are much more difficult for people to kind of figure out what it is they're trying to do. And some critics of theirs have said, you're just giving them very difficult situations so that they're trying to cooperate, they can't figure out what to do, and so they appear to be acting egocentrically. So the task matters in terms of where you come down on this debate. Another one,